Good afternoon. Welcome to The Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to India-Japan relations, as Prime Minister Modi is visiting Japan to attend the 15th annual India-Japan summit as India seeks to deepen its ties with Japan. The second article is related to deep sea exploration, as India plans to send 3 humans to 6,000 meters depth in the Indian Ocean by 2027 under the Samudriyaan project, which is a part of the Deep Ocean mission. Additionally, in the simplified section, we'll take up 5 more topics which will be helpful for your prelims and mains preparation. The first article is related to India-Japan relations. The context behind it is that Prime Minister Modi is visiting Japan for attending the 15th annual India-Japan summit. This visit is significant, especially given the current uncertainty in the global geopolitics triggered by USA. So we will discuss the evolution of India-Japan ties, the significance of Japan for India, also the significance of India for Japan, and the challenges in the bilateral relations, and a few suggestions in this regard. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developed and Developing Countries on India's Interests and Indian Diaspora. The India-Japan ties are crucial for ensuring the stability and growth in the Indo-Pacific region. The ties between the two countries have been deepening because of the shared vision, the shared goals of ensuring regional stability in the Indo-Pacific and of balancing China. Therefore, even before the times of the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, the two countries had been coming closer. If you look at the trajectory of the ties between India and Japan, especially in the past 2 decades, we can categorize it under 4 phases. The first phase starts with the era of the strategic reset, which began under the Japanese PM Hatoyama. You don't need to remember the names of the Japanese prime ministers. They have been mentioned to explain the significance of the deepening of the ties between the two countries and how the two countries have been coming closer and closer continuously, especially in the past 15 years or so. So Japan had the vision of establishing an East Asian community, for which they were recalibrating their foreign policy also, and India becomes a natural fit in this because India is a rising democracy. Therefore Japan wanted India to be a part of this, and investment started in India. Japan started investing in India. For example, the investments happening through the JICA, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, through which it goes for investments in the foreign countries, gives loans to the foreign countries, and the investments happened in India for infrastructure development, for industrial development, for example the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor. But at that time Japan was cautious, it was a little wary in deepening the defense cooperation with India because it did not want to antagonize China or counter China directly. The next phase comes in the form of the era of the strategic consolidation. The Japanese PM can further solidify the ties with India. For example, Japan participated in the Malabar naval exercises with India. Despite the Great East Japan earthquake, despite the Fukushima disaster in Japan, the ties between India and Japan were being solidified. There was also the commencement of the CEPA, that is Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, and also the talks were initiated. The talks were initiated for putting in place an agreement, a civil nuclear cooperation agreement between India and Japan. The next phase comes in the form of the elevation, the strategic elevation, which was done by the Japanese PM Shinzo Abe, and therefore Japan became a permanent participant of the Malabar naval exercises. The free and open Indo-Pacific strategy was adopted, which India also supported, and the annual dialogues were put in place. The annual 2+2 dialogues, the dialogues between foreign and the defense ministers of India and Japan. Therefore various agreements were signed, like the defense equipment and technology transfer agreements between India and Japan. Simultaneously, there were major investments happening in the infrastructure also, the infrastructure development in India, for example, the Mumbai Ahmedabad high speed rail project. And there was the deepening of the cultural diplomacy. The promotion of the cultural diplomacy was observed. For example, 2017 was celebrated as the India Japan year of the friendly exchanges, thereby deepening the cultural ties also. The next era comes in the form of the pragmatic continuity, which is being adopted by the Japanese prime ministers after the Shinzo Abe. For example, the PM Suga of Japan, he also continued the legacy of Shinzo Abe. For example, the continuous adoption of the free and open Indo-Pacific and the participation in Quad as well. Likewise, the Japan PM Kishida has the focus on the cybersecurity, supply chains, diversification, and the green energy. And therefore, the Japan-India digital partnership was launched. Under this, there was the promotion of the artificial intelligence and the cooperation for the promotion of the startup ecosystem. And for the diversification of the supply chains, PM Kishida even pledged money. For example, about $42 billion were pledged by Japanese PM Kishida for the diversification of the supply chains. And under the Japanese PM Ishiba, the current Japanese Prime Minister, there is focus upon the defense cooperation and the multilateral engagement also. And there are expectations that new collaboration avenues will be explored for deeper collaboration in the space sector as well as the satellite technology. Now let's discuss the significance of India-Japan ties. Why is Japan so important for India? When we look at it from the geo-economic point of view, Japan has given us major financial commitments. Japan has committed that it will invest about 10 trillion Japanese yen into India, which amounts to almost 70 billion US dollars, which is a significant amount of investment in India. Also, there is significant FDI coming into India from Japan. Japan is the fifth largest source of FDI into India. When we look at the recent data in fiscal year 2024, Japanese FDI into India amounted to more than $3 billion. And we need cooperation from Japan for the strategic economic diversification. We want to diversify the supply chains. We do not want to remain dependent upon China for the supply of the critical minerals also. Therefore, there is a proposal that during this visit, there may be the signing of an economic security initiative. The proposed economic security initiative, which will deepen the cooperation in some sectors, especially semiconductors, the critical minerals and the pharmaceuticals, etc. And we may be able to get access for the strategic financing for security through the overseas security assistance of Japan also. When we look at it from the geostrategic perspective, Japan is important for us because the Japanese approach has been changing now from a pacifist restraint to an active engagement in security. For example, after the World War II, there were certain restrictions which were imposed upon Japan, that it could not maintain the land, air or naval forces or the other war potential as per the Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. But the successive governments in Japan, they interpreted the clause as meaning that they could maintain the self-defense forces, which could be used strictly for the defensive purposes, only for the defensive purposes. But at least Japan was ousted from the global defense trade. But the situation slightly changed. In 2014, the Japanese PM Shinzo Abe and the Japanese government came up with the three principles for the technology transfer and the defense equipment, which it could share with the other countries then. Why did it happen? Because of the rising Chinese threat. The Chinese military assertiveness was rising. Simultaneously, there was threat from North Korea, the missile threats of North Korea. Therefore, these developments led to the eventual signing of a deal with Australia also. For example, the Japanese frigate deal with Australia, the recent one. Because now Japan has started sharing the defense technology and defense equipments also, it has started exporting. Therefore, India may also be able to benefit in the future geostrategically looking. And also, we need cooperation from Japan for enhanced the defense and security frameworks. For example, there is participation in the joint exercises like the Malabar exercise along with USA and Australia, the Milan exercise, which is a multilateral naval exercise, the JIMEX exercise, the bilateral maritime exercise, and the Dharma Guardian, the army exercise. And there will be operational convergence also. For example, the participation in the Malabar exercise that showcases the joint vision of ensuring a free and open Indo-Pacific, along with that the operational convergence between the forces. And there are shared strategic concerns also, the strategic concerns related to China. For example, the Chinese military assertiveness has been rising both in the South China Sea as well as in the East China Sea. And likewise, the naval presence of the Chinese in the Indian Ocean has also been rising. Therefore, there are shared concerns of India and Japan. Simultaneously, there are territorial tensions also because China has territorial disputes with almost all of its neighbors. For example, the Senkaku Islands dispute between China and Japan, which China claims as its own. Similarly, the border disputes between India and China, we have seen what happened in the Galwan Valley, Doklam Plateau, etc. Then from the geopolitical point of view as well, we need cooperation from Japan because for the establishment of a rules based order, there has to be shared values, shared democratic values for ensuring the freedom of navigation, and there is a non-zero sum engagement between the two countries. It is not based upon the transactional natures only, rather it is based upon ensuring of the regional stability as well as the strategic autonomy. And India is the cornerstone of Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy, and Japan can also function as India's strategic anchor because there is unpredictability that we get from USA, there is competition that we get from China, there is reliability that we can get from Japan, and we'll be able to assert our strategic autonomy also. For example, the deepening of the ties between India and Japan while balancing India-China relations, and this will also ensure the stability in the Quad also, given the uncertainty regarding the participation of the USA. And from the technological point of view as well, the India-Japan ties are significant because Japan willingly transfers us technology. For example, the transfer of the bullet train technology, the Shinkansen rail, which is the cutting edge technology that Japan is giving us in the form of the Mumbai-Ahmedabad high-speed rail corridor. And the digital partnership has also been upgraded now. Therefore, the cooperation will be deepening in the artificial intelligence sector and even the breeding of the startups, establishing the startup ecosystems. In the other areas also, the Japan ties are significant for us. For example, the maritime domain awareness will be promoted, and the India-Japan ties will serve as a model for the regional cooperation among the other countries also. And the India-Japan ties, they are based upon the long-term strategic intent. They are not based upon the short-term gains, and there are ties between the people as well. For example, more than 50,000 Indians live in Japan currently, and the tourism is also promoted between India and Japan. For example, 2023-2024 was celebrated as the year of tourism between India and Japan. Additionally, Japan is significant for us for the development of Northeast India because Japan is the major foreign player which is involved in the development of the Northeast region, and it aligns with our goals also. There is strategic alignment in the development of the Northeast and the investment from Japan in the Northeast region of India. For example, it furthers the goal of India under the Act East policy, and it also furthers the vision of Japan under the free and open Indo-Pacific region. And Japan gives us loans, for example, through the Japan's International Cooperation Agency as well as the Overseas Development Assistance, through which it has been giving annual loans to the tune of more than 200 billion Japanese yen. About 230 billion Japanese yen were given in 2024 itself. And there is a focus upon the infrastructure regarding the cooperation between India and Japan. For example, the development of the roads. About 750 kilometers of new roads have been built under the Northeast Road Connectivity Improvement Project, in which Japan is also cooperating with India. It is building enhanced connectivity, for example, the connectivity of the Northeast region of India with the Southeast Asia, which will further the trade links as well as the connectivity with the ASEAN countries. And it is also taking up the infrastructure development projects in the urban development sector. For example, the development of the water supply and the sanitation projects in the cities like Guwahati, And it is significant for ensuring the environmental sustainability also. For example, it is also cooperating in the management and the implementation of the sustainable forest management project in Tripura. And there is energy cooperation as well in the northeast region of India and Japan. For example, Japan gave the green loan for the establishment of the green energy projects in the region to the tune of 120 billion Japanese yen, and it is also supporting the export of the green ammonia from the region, for which it is establishing the infrastructure also there. Japan also supports the bamboo initiative. For the development of the same, it is setting up the hub and spoke model for the promotion of the bamboo, exploring the other usages of bamboo, because it will lead to the sustainability in the infrastructure projects also. And Japan is also going for investments in the healthcare sector as well in the northeast region. For example, the building of the medical college hospitals, example in Kohima in Nagaland. And there is the deepening of the people to people ties also between the northeast region of India and Japan. For example, the educational programs, the Japanese language programs have been started in the universities of Assam. And there is the historical connection as well. For example, Japan is also cooperating in the renovation and the maintenance of the World War II era memorial sites in the Manipur and Nagaland. Simultaneously, in the recent times also, in the Advantage Assam 2.0 summit, Japan again gave commitments regarding the investments in the clean energy sector and in the semiconductor industries establishment in the region. Simultaneously, it is not only India that needs Japan. Japan also needs India. For example, Japan is experiencing a demographic winter. The aging population in Japan has been increasing, whereas India is experiencing a demographic dividend. So we can share some of our human resources with Japan so that its growth continues. And India also offers a large market to Japan. It can export to India, it can export products to India, and India also offers the investment opportunities as well for the Japanese money, the investments in infrastructure, industrial corridors, etc. And we also have provided the raw material to Japan in the past, for example, the iron ore which was needed by Japan for the reconstruction after the World War. But there are certain challenges that the India-Japan ties face. For example, the bilateral trade. The bilateral trade between the India and Japan has remained low. Despite the implementation of the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, the bilateral trade in fiscal year 2024 between India and Japan was just about $22 billion. There are several reasons behind it. For example, the Indian exports into Japan, they are facing stringent quality checks, the stringent quality standards which are imposed. Therefore, there are non-tariff barriers which are imposed by the Japanese upon the imports from India. And there are strategic divergences also. For example, the stance on China. The stance on China is slightly different. For example, when there is a border dispute between India and China along the line of actual control, India is vocal about it. India criticizes the Chinese actions, whereas the Indian response to the Chinese overtures in the South China Sea or the East China Sea remains relatively muted. Also, the stance on Russia-Ukraine war is also different. For example, Japan has agreed to the sanctions which were imposed upon Russia during the Russia-Ukraine war, whereas India continues to import Russian oil because we need oil for fulfilling the crude oil needs, the energy demands of Indian demography. Regarding the ties with the US also, there is slight change in stance. For example, the Japan is in the US camp, whereas India maintains the strategic autonomy. Also, the Osaka track, which was proposed by Japan during the G20 summit in 2019, that was opposed by India. It was proposing for the negotiations regarding the digital trade, for putting in place international norms, rules and standards for the digital trade, and also the prohibition of the data localization norms, etc., which India opposed. Another factor is the delay in the implementation of the projects, the delays in the projects of the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, even the bullet train project in India as well. Now, what are the suggestions that we can give for further deepening of the India-Japan ties? We need to ensure that there is coherence, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. For example, the convergence of the opinions in the multilateral engagements like the Quad initiative. There should be deepening of cooperation in the emerging areas. The emerging areas, for example, biotechnology and healthcare, in nanoscience, in the space sector as well. And we can review the implementation of the CEPA as well, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, because there needs to be deepening of the trade ties and also the investment as well. Further, there can be deepening of cooperation in the business to business groups, as well as the people to people ties and the cultural ties can be deepened. Now there is a mains practice question also. India-Japan relations have evolved into a strategic partnership rooted in shared democratic values and mutual interests in the Indo-Pacific. Examine the significance of India-Japan ties in the current global context. Discuss the major challenges impeding deeper cooperation between the two nations. Please try to write it. The next article is related to deep sea exploration. The context behind it is that India plans to send 3 humans to the deep sea to the depths of 6,000 meters by 2027 under the Samudriyaan project. The project is part of the Deep Ocean Mission. So we will discuss the significance of deep sea exploration, the challenges that India faces in the deep sea exploration, and the government initiatives in this regard. This is important in GS3 under the topic Science and Technology. India launched its own deep ocean mission, which was approved by the cabinet in 2021. Now, under this, there is the Samudriyaan project. Through the successful implementation of the Samudriyaan project, India will also possess the deep sea exploration capabilities. India will join the select group of a few nations which have the deep sea exploration capabilities, for example, USA, Russia, China, Japan, and France. The Deep Ocean Mission had various components, including the development of technologies for deep sea mining, the development of underwater vehicles and robotics, including a crewed submersible, the development of the Ocean Climate Change Advisory Service, and the observations and the models for future projections of the climate variables, the technological innovations for conservation of the deep sea biodiversity, deep ocean surveys, the exploration of the mineral deposits, especially the polymetallic nodules, the development of technologies to derive energy from the ocean and fresh water from the ocean, and the establishment of an advanced marine station as well for developing capabilities in the ocean biology and engineering. For this purpose, the United Nations International Seabed Authority has allocated to us 75,000 square kilometers area in the central Indian Ocean basin, where we will be able to explore minerals, will be able to study the marine biodiversity also, and the seabed is host to a large variety of minerals, for example the copper, nickel, cobalt, manganese, etc. The valuation of these minerals and the polymetallic nodules that can be extracted from the deep sea bed is estimated to be more than 100 billion US dollars. Now, what is the significance of deep sea exploration? Why do we need to push for the development of the capabilities and technologies for the deep sea exploration? Because the deep sea is a hub for the mineral resources and energy resources. It is estimated that the Indian Ocean deep sea, the seabed contains about 380 million metric tons of polymetallic nodules and minerals. If we are able to extract even 10% out of it, that will meet India's energy needs for the next 100 years approximately. The deep sea exploration can help us in fulfilling the food security needs. For example, we'll be able to access the fisheries and the marine biodiversity of the deep sea as well. And as per the estimates of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the marine biotechnology can contribute up to $100 million by 2025 itself. Through the deep sea exploration capabilities, we can go for environmental research and climate research. For example, if we have the deep sea exploration capabilities, we can ensure long-term ocean monitoring. We can even predict the tsunamis, we can predict the cyclones, we can predict the sea level rise also. Also, the deep sea exploration will help us in the maintenance of the undersea infrastructure. For example, the maintenance of the fiber optic cables. 95% of the global internet traffic passes through the fiber optic cables which are laid in the deep sea. Also, the maintenance of the oil pipelines, mining equipment, as well as the research stations will be easy for India then. It will ensure maritime security also for India, because we can do the mapping of the deep sea, we can go for the deep sea maritime domain awareness also, and it will help us in fulfilling our goal of establishing a blue economy as well. But there are certain challenges that India faces in the deep sea exploration. For example, in the deep sea, there are extreme pressures. At 6,000 meters of depth, the pressure is more than 600 times the atmospheric pressure. Therefore, the vessel which is operating at such depth, its structural integrity is very important. It has to be built using special materials like titanium alloys, so that it can withstand that kind of pressure. And titanium is a rare material which the other countries are not willing to share. Also, even the fabrication is a complicated task. The fabrication of the vessel which is having the titanium alloys, it is done using the electron beam welding, and it is done by the ISRO in India. Simultaneously, if there are aquanauts which are sent in the vessel, for them the livable environment has to be maintained. There have to be life support systems, the oxygen levels which have to be maintained, the carbon dioxide levels have to be managed. At the same time, the rebreather oxygen systems have to be installed, which recirculate the exhaled air after removing the carbon dioxide and adding the oxygen. At the same time, the acoustic communication is also difficult, because radio waves, which are the basis for the day-to-day communication, they can't be used in the deep sea. Rather, acoustic telephones are used, which carry the information laden sound waves to a receiver which is placed just underneath the surface of the water. And simultaneously, we can observe that there are risks also. For example, the Ocean Gate Titan submersible disaster which had happened. And there are environmental risks also. The deep sea exploration, it may impact the deep sea ecology adversely, the deep sea marine organisms also adversely. The costs of the building of the deep sea exploration vessels are very high. The costs are prohibitive. For example, the Matsya 6000, which was built under the Samudrayan project, that itself cost about 350 crores. There are technological barriers also which India has to get from the other countries. There are infrastructural constraints also, because India needs to develop the capabilities for the manufacturing of the autonomous underwater vehicles, the robotics in the deep sea, the remotely operated vehicles which can operate in the deep sea. There are legal and geopolitical constraints as well. Legal constraints, for example, we have to comply with the UNCLOS regulations. At the same time, geopolitical constraints, for example, we have to face the competition from the other countries, for example, China, USA and Russia. What are the government initiatives then that have been taken up for the deep sea exploration? The government launched the Deep Ocean Mission, within which the Samudrayan project is also taken up. That was taken up under the Ministry of Earth Sciences, to ensure that we develop capabilities of the mineral exploration as well as the marine biodiversity study. And under the Samudrayan mission, the Matsya 6000 vessel was developed, that is to send the humans to the deep sea. And the National Institute of Ocean Technology is developing the autonomous underwater vehicles and the remotely operated vehicles, as well as the underwater robotics and the mining system which can be used in the deep sea. The mapping of the exclusive economic zone and the extended continental shelf is conducted by the National Center for the Polar and Oceanic Research for mapping of the exclusive economic zone of India as well as the extended continental shelf. Simultaneously, the ocean thermal energy conversion and the offshore energy projects, they are implemented by the National Institute of Ocean Technologies to ensure that we are able to harness the ocean thermal energy also. Now, what are the suggestions that we can give for promoting deep sea exploration by India? One, we need to establish institutions of excellence that are working in the research and development and the development of the technologies needed for the deep sea exploration. We can give more push towards the funding and the incentivization of the private sector as well for the development of the startups in this sector. And a strong and empowered body can also be set up for the regulation of the deep sea exploration activities. There can be a setting up of a full-fledged ministry of Ocean Development. The Department of Ocean Development can be converted into a full-fledged ministry. Simultaneously, the projects can be taken up in the mission mode. For example, the quick approvals can be given, the ease of doing business must be ensured in the deep sea exploration sector. Also, we have to note that the deep sea exploration technologies, they are inherently dual use technologies. Therefore, their misuse or the use in the conflict prone zones should be avoided. Now there is a mains practice question also. Deep sea exploration holds immense potential for India's energy security, resource diversification and scientific advancement. Discuss the significance and challenges of deep sea exploration for India. What are the major initiatives undertaken by the government to promote it? Please try to write it. The next article is related to the cotton crop and the import duty exemption from cotton. This is important in GS3 under the topic major crops, cropping patterns in various parts of the country. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding the cotton crop. What are the growing conditions? What are the challenges in the growth of cotton in India? The growing conditions with respect to climate include the requirement of hot and sunny weather, which is required for the growing of cotton. Cotton requires long frost-free periods of at least 210 days for the growth, and the temperatures should not be less than 21 degrees Celsius or more than 30 degrees Celsius, and the rainfall should be 50 to 75 centimeters. On what kind of soils can cotton be grown? It can grow best on the Deccan Plateau black cotton soil. The deep alluvial soils in the North India, where the alluvial soil is brought by the rivers, that is also suitable. The black clay soils in the central India is also suitable for cotton growth, and it is grown even in the mixed black and red soils also in the southern region. It is usually sensitive to salinity, but it can tolerate some amount of salinity, and it is vulnerable to waterlogging also, which should be avoided. For the growth, it is the Kharif season crop and it requires 6 to 8 months to mature for the cotton. But there are certain challenges that the growing of cotton in India faces. For example, the pink bollworm pest usually affects cotton and it has reduced the cotton yields in some states, for example Gujarat, Punjab, Haryana and Rajasthan. It has also led to unpredictable yields also sometimes, which include several other factors. For example, the limited irrigation leads to unpredictable yield of cotton, declining soil fertility as well as erratic weather at times. For example, unexpected droughts and excessive rainfall, which we have seen recently. The traditional farming methods is also another challenge for the cotton productivity in India. For example, most of the farmers, they are small scale farmers. They do not have access to the modern technologies, which brings down the cotton productivity and the lack of access to the economy of scale. Also, the rain-fed cultivation of cotton in India amounts to about 2/3 of the cotton crop area. The yield of cotton is also low in India, which is about 480 kg of cotton per hectare, which is produced in India as compared to the global average of 800 kg of cotton production per hectare. Now, what are the government initiatives taken up to promote cotton in India? The government came up with the Cotton Development Program. It was launched under the National Food Security Mission under the Department of Agriculture. The Cotton Corporation of India was set up. The aim of the Cotton Corporation is to stabilize the prices of cotton when the market rates are falling. The government came up with the MSP formula also, while fixing the MSP at 1.5 times the production cost. There was the setting up of the Textile Advisory Group as well. The advisory group coordinates the productivity of the cotton, the pricing of the cotton and the branding of the cotton. The government also promotes the Coat Ally mobile app, through which the MSP rates of cotton are shared and the procurement center information is also shared with the farmers. The Committee on Cotton Promotion and Consumption was set up to ensure that there is steady cotton supply for the textile industry. Now, what are the major cotton producing states in India? The major states include Gujarat, followed by Maharashtra, Telangana, Rajasthan and Karnataka. Now, coming to the article, to ensure that there is enough availability of cotton for the domestic textile industry, the government had removed the import duty that was imposed upon cotton earlier. The exemption from the import duty imposition on cotton was given till 30th September 2025. Now that exemption has been extended till 31st December 2025. This had been a long-standing demand of the domestic textile industry, as they had been demanding removal of import duty on cotton, although government had earlier imposed about 11% import duty on cotton to safeguard the domestic farmers. Although recently the MSP for cotton has been increased significantly, as the cotton production had been declining in India over several years. But the exemption now from the imposition of import duty on cotton has been extended till December 31st. This period is coinciding with the cotton plucking season, which is usually from the October to March. That is the time when the farmers are selling the cotton. Therefore, there will be some impact on the farmers. Another reason behind this exemption was that the textile imports and the apparel imports into the US were increasing from the other countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh, and the exports from India were declining. And the textile sector in India is dominated by cotton, and the cotton value chain provides employment to significant number of people, about 35 million people directly, and 80% of the India's total textile exports are for the cotton only. And India now aims to more than double the textile and apparel exports by 2030. The next article is related to the compensation for the states for the revenue loss that they may face with the imposition of a two-tier structure for the GST. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. There is a debate whether the state should be compensated for the revenue loss that they may face with the average lowering of the GST rates and the imposition of a two-tier GST structure. So first let's discuss the probable impact of the imposition of a two-tier structure for GST on the revenues. The estimated annual impact may be about 60,000 crore to 1 lakh crore. That amounts to 0.2 to 0.3% of India's GDP if we are switching from the earlier GST regime to the two-tier structure with the imposition of 5% and 18% of GST slabs. The initial implementation year, that is fiscal year 2026, may be a hit of about 45,000 crores. But this revenue loss may not be permanent. This revenue loss can be recouped by other measures. For example, about 40% tax rate can be imposed on the sin goods and the luxury goods which are not needed, and the consumption may be expected to increase. When the tax rate will be lowered, the prices will come down. Therefore, for the essential goods and for the consumer durables, the consumption rates may increase, which may lead to further higher collection of the revenues. Also, the compliance is expected to improve. With the formal billing system, the leakages will be plugged. Therefore, the revenue loss may not be permanent and it can be compensated. The 18% slab remains largely unchanged, and it accounts for about 70% of India's GST revenue collections. And the average GST rate which will be expected will be about 10%. The current is about 11.5%, so there won't be much impact that way on the revenues, but it will still be significant when we look at the numbers. And there will be non-uniform impact also. For example, there will be a visible hit, significant impact on the manufacturing states, the service heavy states. For example, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu will see a significant revenue decline because of the lowering of the GST. And the agriculture dependent states, for example, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, they will have lesser impact. Likewise, the states with a narrower tax base, for example, the states in the northeast India, they will also have a lesser impact. Now, should the state's revenue be protected in case the GST slabs are switched to only two-tier structure? The initial 5-year compensation guarantee was given to the states when the GST was first introduced. That first 5-year guarantee for the revenue compensation is technically over. Now, can we put in place a regular compensation mechanism? It may be unsustainable because it will lead to a significant burden on the exchequer of the central government. Rather, there is an expectation now from the states that the states will become self-sufficient in the tax collection. How? They are supposed to either widen their tax base, or they are supposed to plug the leakages in the tax collection so that the compliance rates improve and simultaneously the tax base also broadens so that they become self-sufficient in the tax revenue generation and collection. But the revenue distribution itself remains equal. For example, some states have high manufacturing bases as well as the industrial bases and service bases. So therefore there are a couple of suggestions also from this debate to create new mechanisms for the support for the states. One, we can consider exploring setting up a contingency fund, a dedicated contingency fund for the compensation of the revenue loss in case the GST structures, the GST slabs are changed. For example, the Kerala state of Kerala imposed a flood cess for the reconstruction recovery after the floods, and there can also be a support which can be allocated for specific situations from the Consolidated Fund of India. Some developed countries had experimented with it in the past. When the GST was initially introduced in some developed countries, their special provisions were put in place for specific situations whereby the funds were given from the funds of the nation. And there will be long-term benefits in case the GST slabs are revised, because it will be attracting investment, because the consumption increases, that will attract investment also. The consumption increases because of the lowering of the tax rate and the subsequent lowering of the prices of the goods. Simultaneously, it will boost the tax base as well, because there will be new investments, newer companies setting up more production, leading to the increase in the tax base as well. Now let's discuss a few provisions regarding the GST Council as well, which will need to approve this for the implementation of the two-tier structure of the GST. The GST Council composition is provided for under the Constitution itself under Article 279A Clause 2, that there shall be a chairperson of the GST Council and the members. The members of the GST Council will include the Minister of State for Finance and the finance ministers of the state governments. The vice chairperson of the GST Council shall be elected by the members of the GST Council. What will be the functions of the GST Council? They are provided again under Article 279A Clause 4, that it shall recommend for the taxes, cesses and surcharges which may be subsumed under the GST. It shall also recommend for the goods and services that may be subjected to GST or exempted from GST. It will form the model GST laws, principles of levy, apportionment of the GST levied in the course of the interstate trade, the principles that govern the place of supply as well. It will also determine the threshold limit of the turnover below which there shall be exemption from GST, and it shall also determine the floor rates with the bands of the GST, and it can also recommend for a special rate for the additional resources, for example the generation of revenues to overcome a natural calamity or a disaster, etc. Article 279A Clause 5 provides that the GST Council may recommend the dates from which the petroleum and natural gas and the aviation turbine fuel can be brought under the purview of GST. Clause 11 of the article provides for the mechanism to adjudicate if there are any disputes. Now, how does the GST Council function? For its quorum, for any decision to be taken, at least half of the total members must be present, and for every decision to be taken, at least that many members should be present and voting, which account for 3/4 of the total weighted votes in the council, and the central government thereby enjoys the weightage of 1/3 of the total votes cast in the GST Council. The next article is related to the Assam King Pruthu. This is important in GS1 under the topic Indian History, Significant Events and Personalities. The Assamese King Prithu is being projected as an Assamese icon after the earlier Ahom general Lachit Borphukan. Lachit Borphukan was credited with defeating the Mughal army in 1671 in the Battle of Saraighat. Now it is claimed that the Assamese king Prithu was able to defeat Bakhtiyar Khilji in Assam. Bakhtiyar Khilji was a military general of the invader Muhammad of Ghor. He had led a series of campaigns in eastern India, and he is commonly associated with the sacking, the destruction of the Buddhist monastery of Nalanda. But the identity of the local ruler who had defeated the armies of Khilji is unclear. The most direct written reference is a rock inscription which was found in Kanai Barsa Boa in Guwahati, and it mentions that the Turks who had entered the Kamrup in Assam were destroyed in the Saka area, but does not name any local ruler. But the Persian chronicle The Tawakat-e-Nasiri contains the details of a military defeat at the hands of the Rai of Kamrup, and it refers to a ruler named Bhartu. It is claimed that Prithu's another name was Bhartu. And then Kanaklal Barua in the book History of Kamrupa had written that it is very probable that this Prithu Raja was the king of Kamrup who caused the destruction of Bakhtiyar's forces in 1206 AD, and the capital of Prithu was North Guwahati. So let's also discuss about the Nalanda University, which was destroyed by Bakhtiyar Khilji. The new Nalanda University campus is near the Rajgir's ancient university ruins. It was the most ancient university on the Indian subcontinent. The founder of Nalanda was Kumar Gupta. In the early 5th century it was founded. It existed during the era of the Harshvardhan and the Palas. It was a center of learning, a center of culture as well as intellectual exchange in the region. And it also contained a monastic establishment, and the students came from China, Korea, Japan, Tibet, etc. Various subjects were taught at Nalanda including medicine, Ayurveda, religion, Buddhism, mathematics, astronomy, Indian philosophy, etc. And it was destroyed in 1193 by the Turkish ruler Qutbuddin Aybak's general Bakhtiyar Khilji. It is even recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The next article is related to the issues of elderly women in India and the need of care for the elderly women. This is important in GS2 under the topic welfare schemes for the vulnerable sections of the population, mechanisms, laws, institutions and bodies constituted for the protection and betterment of these vulnerable sections. First, what are the issues that the elderly women face in India? Their average lifespan is longer than that of men. They live long, but the lives are unhealthier lives because of the lack of access to the healthcare, and they face various socio-cultural barriers also, which leads to the decline in their health. For example, they are supposed to take care of the other family members first. They are burdened with the societal expectations that they put the health and wellness of the other family members first before they take care of themselves. And their decisions are also not autonomous. Their decisions are subject to the decisions of the gatekeepers, that is the male family members or their own spouses. And the financial security is not prevalent among the elderly women. They face financial insecurity and dependency. About 60% of elderly women in India have no personal income. 20% elderly women in India cannot pay for their own healthcare expenses also. There is a lack of healthcare insurance, especially for the elderly women, because either their healthcare insurance is tied to the healthcare insurance of their spouses, or they do not have a healthcare insurance plan at all. And there is a digital gender gap also, which is more in the case of the elderly women, because they do not know how to operate the devices and they have the technological barriers. There are physical access barriers also. For example, the distance to the healthcare service providers, the healthcare institutions, etc. And there is a lack of gender sensitive care also, especially for the elderly women. There is lack of availability of sufficient number of female healthcare service providers. There is underdiagnosis of chronic conditions. For example, the bone related problems which are prevalent among the elderly women, like osteoporosis, arthritis, similarly the gynecological problems, etc. There is underdiagnosis. Regarding cancer diagnosis also, there is late stage cancer diagnosis, especially the cervix cancer, ovarian cancer, breast cancer, etc. There is a higher risk of neurodegenerative diseases among the elderly women. For example, the prevalence of dementia, Alzheimer's, which go undetected altogether. And there is a neglect of the mental health also. And they face problems of depression and anxiety due to loneliness, caregiving stress, and widowhood as well. Now, what are the suggestions for the improvement of care for the elderly women in India? One, there should be an inclusive data collection. The data collection should be gender disaggregated. It should be collected separately for the men and women for the elderly. And There should be a community based outreach as well. We can scale up the mobile health units. For example, in Kerala there is a Vayomitram project which the state government has taken up to ensure that the healthcare services reach their doorstep if they cannot come to the healthcare service institutions. And there should be a comprehensive geriatric screening for the underdiagnosed conditions, for example osteoporosis, dementia, etc. We can strengthen the national program for healthcare of the elderly with a specific focus on women. There can be pension reforms also. For example, care credits can be given for the informal labor that goes into care, and the state pensions, they can be indexed to inflation more. There can be an evolution in the health insurance also. For example, providing for the outpatient diagnostics coverage also compulsorily for the geriatrics care for the elderly women especially. We can also integrate the assistive schemes, for example linking of the Rashtriya Vyoshri Yojana with the local healthcare workers, so that there is an outreach of the assistive schemes. For example, the physical aids and devices are provided under the Rashtriya Vyoshri Yojana and the elderly women are able to seek their benefits. There can be a promotion of the social support groups. For example, the Kerala's Kudumbashri model, so that the elderly women can also live a productive life. There can be a building of the senior friendly infrastructure, the physical infrastructure as well as the social infrastructure. There can be a training for the healthcare workers also, so that there is sensitization towards the issues, the peculiar issues of the elderly women. The next article is related to the demographic dividend, which may become a time bomb if the demographic dividend is not effectively utilized in India. This is important in GS1 under the topic population and the associated issues. The topic of demographic dividend we have already covered in the past month. Today we'll be covering the challenges which the article mentions regarding the utilization of the demographic dividend in India. The education system, as the author claims, is outdated and it prepares students for the disappearing jobs. Therefore, it leads to a mismatch between the skills that are required for the industry and the education, the skills that the academia is giving, that the educational institutions are providing. It leads to a widespread skill mismatch, and therefore only about 43% people in India are deemed to be employable. The remaining people, even though highly literate, highly educated, they are still deemed to be unemployable because the skills that they have, they are not matching with the requirements of the industry. There is a high graduate unemployability also, as about 50% of the engineering graduates remain unplaced from the campuses. And there is a threat which comes from the automation also, the threat because of the automation and artificial intelligence to the jobs, and 70% of the Indian jobs are at risk because of the automation. There is a lack of career awareness also. As per the author, about 93% people, the students in India, are aware of only about 7 traditional careers. They are not aware of about 20,000 modern career paths also. There is insufficient career guidance. About 7% of the students in the schools get formal career guidance only. There are misaligned choices also. The graduates, they go for poor choices. Their choices of the subjects in which they are completing their degrees, about 65% are pursuing degrees which are not of their interest or which are not as per the needs of the market to ensure their employability. Also, there is a traditional focus on the exams, which leads to ineffective development of the skills and the skilling initiatives taken up by the government, as the author claims. For example, the Skill India mission, they have also not proven as effective in ensuring their employability. Regarding the online certificate courses which are provided by the edtech platforms, again their focus is on the preparation of the tests, and therefore their certificates which are provided, they are also losing value. There is a risk of social unrest therefore. Unless the demographic dividend that is there at the disposal of India is utilized effectively, it may lead to widespread protests also, which is the fear of the author, which may lead to the social unrest and even tearing of the social fabric for India. Therefore, we need to ensure that the demographic dividend, the energy, the skills, the resources, because they are human resources and they can be utilized and they energy can be channelized in the positive direction. Thank you.